A veteran's dog waits 8 long years at the same place, refusing to move, no matter the storms, the seasons, or the passing strangers. Day after day, he stays by the door of the abandoned shop, holding on to a hope that everyone else gave up on. Then, just when it seems too late, a miracle happens, one that no one in town could have ever seen coming. What was this dog waiting for? And how could his quiet loyalty change not just one life, but an entire town forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The golden evening light streamed through the dusty windows of Sam Rivers' woodshop, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Fine particles of sawdust danced in the warm beams as Sam ran his calloused hands over the small oak chair he'd been working on all afternoon. His movements were careful and precise, the sandpaper smoothing away the last rough spots with practiced ease. The rhythmic sound of a tail thumping against the wooden doorframe made Sam glance up. Through the open door, he could see Patch, his faithful companion of 8 years, dozing in his usual spot. The brown and white mixed-breed dog's ears perked up at Sam's attention, and his tail picked up its gentle beating against the wood. "Almost done, buddy," Sam said softly, his voice barely carrying over the whisper of sandpaper on wood. The shop around him was a testament to years of dedicated craftsmanship. Tools hung in perfect order on pegboards. Wood samples were neatly stacked against walls, and the air carried the sweet smell of fresh sawdust mixed with lemon oil. Sam stood back, studying the chair's smooth curves and clean lines. It was a simple piece, but there was beauty in its simplicity. He ran his hand along the back one final time, feeling for any imperfections he might have missed. Finding none, he began cleaning up his workspace with the same methodical care he applied to his woodworking. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Sam swept the day's sawdust into neat piles, his movements unhurried. He could hear the distant sounds of cars passing on Main Street. But here in his shop, time seemed to move at its own pace. Finally, he hung up his work apron and flicked off the lights, giving the shop one last look before stepping outside. Patch rose to his feet, stretching lazily before following Sam to the small apartment above the shop. Inside, Sam prepared a simple dinner of heated soup and bread, eating alone at his small kitchen table while Patch crunched kibble from his bowl nearby. The routine was familiar, comfortable in its solitude. After dinner, Sam grabbed a tennis ball from the drawer near the back door. Patch's ears immediately perked up, his whole body wiggling with anticipation. They made their way down to the narrow alley behind the shop, where the evening air was cool and fresh. "All right, boy," Sam said, holding up the ball. Patch's eyes locked onto it, his body coiled like a spring. Sam threw the ball, and Patch bounded after it, his paws clicking against the pavement. Their game of fetch was a nightly ritual, one that hadn't changed in all their years together. As they played, Sam noticed how the buildings around them cast longer shadows than they used to. New signs had replaced old ones, fresh paint covered familiar brick walls, but his little corner of the world remained largely unchanged. The same creaky steps led up to his shop. The same worn wooden sign hung above the door, and the same loyal dog brought back the tennis ball again and again. Finally, Sam settled on the shop's front steps, his bones creaking almost as much as the wood beneath him. Patch flopped down at his feet, panting contentedly. The street lamps were starting to flicker on, casting pools of warm light along the sidewalk. Across the street, Mrs. Callahan appeared on her porch, watering the hanging baskets of petunias that had been there as long as Sam could remember. She caught his eye and raised her hand in a gentle wave. "Good evening, Sam," she called out softly. Sam nodded and lifted his hand in return. a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Mrs. Callahan had been his neighbor for 20 years, as reliable as the seasons in her quiet presence. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sharp ring of the shop's landline. Sam frowned slightly. Few people called the old phone these days, and never this late. He pushed himself up from the steps, Patch raising his head curiously at the movement. Inside the shop, Sam picked up the receiver, its familiar weight solid in his hand. "Rivers Woodworking," he answered, his voice steady and professional, despite the hour. As he listened to the voice on the other end, his expression changed. The lines around his mouth deepened, and his shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Yes, I understand," he said after a long moment. "I'll be there as soon as I can." He placed the receiver back in its cradle with deliberate care, then stood for a moment in the growing darkness of his shop. Patch had followed him inside and now stood watching, head tilted slightly to one side. Sam reached for Patch's leash hanging by the door, his movements slower than usual. "I need to step out for a while, boy," he said quietly, not quite meeting his dog's attentive gaze. He clicked on the porch light and locked the shop door behind them. As Sam started down the street, Patch's leash swinging empty in his hand, the dog watched from his spot by the door. The evening had grown quiet, with only the soft buzz of street lamps and distant traffic breaking the silence. Sam's figure grew smaller as he walked away, his shoulders straight but heavy with whatever news the phone call had brought. Thunder cracked overhead, splitting the darkened sky, as Sam Rivers guided his old Ford pickup through the quiet streets of town. The windshield wipers worked furiously against the downpour, their rhythmic swishing barely keeping up with the sheets of rain. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "Should have waited till morning," he muttered, leaning forward to peer through the water-streaked glass. The truck's headlights cut weak paths through the darkness, reflecting off the wet asphalt ahead. Another rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, closer this time, making the cab vibrate slightly. Back at the shop, Patch huddled under the worn green awning, his brown and white fur ruffled by the gusting wind. His eyes remained fixed on the direction Sam had disappeared, ears pricked forward despite the rain spattering around him. Every few minutes a car would pass by, its headlights briefly illuminating the wet street, and Patch's tail would lift hopefully before dropping again when he realized it wasn't Sam's familiar truck. The storm intensified as Sam reached the outskirts of town. The old pickup's engine growled as he pressed the accelerator, trying to maintain speed on the winding highway that led through the hills. Rain hammered against the roof of the cab like thousands of tiny fists, and lightning flashed across the sky in brilliant bursts, momentarily turning night to day. Sam's jaw clenched as he approached a sharp bend in the road. The yellow warning sign flashed briefly in his headlights, its reflective surface gleaming through the rain. He eased off the gas, but the truck's tires still felt loose on the wet pavement. His heart jumped as the back end began to slide. The world seemed to slow down as the pickup's tires lost their grip completely. Sam turned the wheel against the skid, just as he'd been taught, but the rain-slicked road offered no purchase. The guardrail appeared in his headlights, growing larger by the second. There was a moment of terrible clarity before everything went sideways. When, in the darkness, a red taillight spun through the air like a fallen star, end over end, before disappearing into the roadside ditch with a splash. The sound of twisting metal and breaking glass was swallowed by the storm's fury. Miles away, Patch's head snapped up suddenly. He rose to his feet, nose testing the rain-heavy air. Something deep in his chest tightened, and before he could stop himself, a long, mournful howl escaped his throat. The sound carried for a moment before being drowned out by another crash of thunder. The shop's lights cast a warm glow through the rain-streaked windows, creating pools of yellow light on the wet sidewalk. Mrs. Callahan paused at her kitchen window, hands wrapped around a warm cup of chamomile tea. Her eyes drifted to the lit windows of Rivers Woodworking across the street. It wasn't unusual for Sam to work late. She'd seen his lights on at all hours over the years, the sound of his tools a comfortable backdrop to many sleepless nights. She watched Patch's silhouette move restlessly under the awning. "Poor thing must not like the storm," she murmured to herself, taking another sip of tea. The clock on her wall showed it was well past midnight, but she thought nothing of it. Sam was a creature of habit, and his habits often kept odd hours. The storm raged through the night, but eventually the thunder grew distant, and the rain softened to a gentle patter. The sky began to lighten, though the sun remained hidden behind a thick blanket of gray clouds. A cold wind swept down the street, rustling wet leaves and carrying the first hint of autumn's chill. Patch hadn't moved from his post by the shop door. His fur was damp from the rain that had blown under the awning, but he remained alert, watching each car that passed with unwavering attention. His usual spot had worn smooth over the years, and he settled into it naturally, paws tucked beneath him, ears constantly swiveling to catch any familiar sounds. Inside the workshop, everything stood exactly as Sam had left it the evening before. The small oak chair sat in a shaft of gray morning light, its newly sanded surface smooth and ready for finishing. Sam's tools lay in their precise arrangements on the workbench, chisels lined up by size, planes positioned at right angles, measuring tools in their designated spots. A fine layer of sawdust still covered the floor where he'd been working, his footprints visible in the powder. The morning grew older, and the street began to wake up. Shop owners arrived to unlock their doors, and early morning customers hurried past with collars turned up against the cold. The regularity of the scene made the wrongness of the situation even more apparent. The absence of Sam's measured movements behind the shop windows, the silence where there should have been the gentle sounds of woodworking, the sight of Patch still waiting patiently by the door. The chair stood as a silent witness in the workshop, its unfinished state a pause in a conversation that had been suddenly interrupted. Water dripped slowly from the awning outside, each drop marking another moment in the growing quiet. The usual warmth of the shop had seeped away during the night, leaving behind a stillness that seemed to seep into every corner. Mrs. Callahan stepped out onto her porch, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself against the morning chill. Her eyes were drawn immediately to Patch, still maintaining his vigil across the street. The shop's windows remained dark, though the porch light from the night before still burned weakly in the gray morning light. She frowned slightly, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach as she noticed Sam's truck was nowhere to be seen. Inside the workshop, the old wall clock continued its steady ticking, marking time in an empty room. Sam's coffee mug sat on his workbench, half full and long cold. His work apron hung on its hook by the door, waiting to be worn. Everything was precisely where it should be, yet nothing was right. The quiet of the shop seemed to grow deeper with each passing minute, broken only by the occasional sound of cars passing outside and the steady drip of water from the awning where Patch kept his patient watch. 2 days after the storm, the morning sun struggled to break through lingering clouds. Patch hadn't moved from his spot by the shop door, except to stretch his stiff legs occasionally. His stomach growled, but he ignored it, dark eyes fixed on the street, watching and waiting for the familiar sight of Sam's truck. Mrs. Callahan stood at her window, coffee cup forgotten in her hand as she watched the loyal dog. She'd seen him there all day yesterday, and the day before that, maintaining his silent vigil. Something wasn't right. Sam had never left Patch alone this long before. Setting down her cup, She went to her refrigerator and pulled out a container of leftover pot roast. "Poor thing must be starving," she muttered to herself, wrapping her cardigan tightly around her shoulders as she crossed the street. Patch's tail thumped weakly against the concrete when she approached, though his eyes never left the road. "Here you go, sweet boy," Mrs. Callahan said softly, placing small pieces of meat near his paws. She watched as he carefully ate each morsel, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he didn't want to disturb his watching post too much. Later that morning, Mr. Donnelly's heavy footsteps echoed down the sidewalk as he approached the shop. The hardware store owner's weathered face creased with concern as he noticed the closed sign still hanging in the window. He cupped his hands around his eyes, peering through the glass. The workshop sat silent and undisturbed, exactly as it had been days ago. "Sam!" he called out, rapping his knuckles against the door. Patch's ears perked up at the sound, but quickly lowered again when he realized it wasn't Sam's familiar knock. Mr. Donnelly tried the handle, found it locked, and stepped back with a deep frown. He gave Patch a gentle pat on the head before walking away, shaking his head slowly. Days began to blur together, marked only by Patch's unwavering routine. Each morning, he would lift his head at the sound of the first delivery trucks rumbling down the street. Throughout the day, he would watch every passing car, his ears pricking up at each familiar engine sound, only to drop again in disappointment. The neighborhood kids started stopping by on their way to and from school. "Hi, Patch," they would call out, taking turns petting his soft fur. Some would sit with him for a while, telling him about their day as if he could understand every word. Patch accepted their attention quietly, but never left his post. Mr. Martinez from the grocery store began leaving paper bags filled with meat scraps and leftover bones. "Can't let you go hungry, amigo," he'd say, setting the food within easy reach of Patch's spot. The dog would eat carefully, making sure to never miss any approaching footsteps or passing vehicles. Mia, a local teenager who'd grown up watching Sam work through the shop windows, started bringing fresh water every day. She'd empty and clean the small plastic bowl she'd left, refilling it with cool water. Sometimes she'd sit on the step next to Patch, her hand resting gently on his back. "He'll come back," she'd whisper, though her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "You're such a good boy waiting for him." Whispers and theories spread through the town like autumn leaves in the wind. Some folks claimed Sam had simply packed up and left, tired of small-town life. Others, noting his truck's absence and Patch's vigilant waiting, feared something worse had happened. The stories grew and changed with each retelling, but Patch remained constant, a living reminder of unfinished business. The police came by one afternoon, their crisp uniforms and official manner drawing a small crowd of onlookers. They checked the windows and doors, finding them all secure. Through the glass, they could see the workshop exactly as Sam had left it, tools in their places, the half-finished chair still waiting for its final touches. With no signs of forced entry or struggle, they had nothing to go on. The welfare check was filed away, another piece of paper in a growing stack of unanswered questions. As weeks stretched into months, the shop's appearance began to show signs of neglect. Paint bubbled and peeled around the window frames. One of the shutters worked loose in a strong wind, hanging at an awkward angle. Leaves collected in the corners of the steps, unswept and forgotten. Yet Patch remained, his fur growing shaggier, his eyes never losing their patient watchfulness. One morning, the early risers of the town witnessed a small act of recognition. Someone had worked through the night, crafting a simple wooden sign. It appeared above the shop door just before dawn, carved letters spelling out Patch's place in smooth, careful strokes. No one took credit for the sign, but its presence seemed to acknowledge what everyone knew. The shop had become more than just an empty building. It was a testament to loyalty, marked by the quiet presence of one faithful dog. The seasons turned slowly, summer heat giving way to autumn's chill. Leaves changed color and fell, creating a carpet of red and gold around Patch's feet. The first frost came, coating the windows with delicate patterns and making Patch's breath visible in small clouds. When winter arrived, it brought with it a hushed silence as the first snow began to fall. Large flakes drifted down from a pearl-gray sky, gradually coating the street in white. Patch watched the transformation through steady eyes, his fur collecting a dusting of snow. As the temperature dropped, he curled himself into a tighter ball, tucking his nose under his tail for warmth. The snow continued to fall, but Patch didn't move from his post. His dark fur stood out against the growing whiteness, a steady point in the swirling snow. Some neighbors offered him blankets or tried to coax him inside, but he refused to leave his spot. His devotion remained unchanged by the weather, his patience as deep as the snow that was slowly covering the silent street. The carved sign above the door collected its own crown of snow, the letters Patch's Place standing out against the white backdrop. Below it, partially sheltered by the old green awning, Patch maintained his vigil. His body might have been covered in snow, but his spirit remained unshaken. His loyalty as strong as the day Sam had walked away from the shop, promising to return. 8 years had carved deep changes into the old woodshop's facade. Thick green vines crept up the weathered walls like hungry fingers, while dust coated the windows so thoroughly that peering inside had become nearly impossible. The once pristine storefront had surrendered to nature's slow but relentless advance. Patch, too, showed the weight of passing time. His muzzle had grayed considerably, and his movements had grown careful and measured. A slight limp marked his steps now, the result of countless nights spent on the hard concrete. Yet his eyes retained their alertness, scanning the street with the same unwavering dedication that had marked his first days of waiting. The community's care for Patch had evolved into an unspoken routine. Every morning, Emma, a third grader with bright red ribbons in her hair, would carefully lay a fresh blanket next to him on her way to school. She'd collect the previous day's blanket, take it home to wash, and return with a clean one the next morning. Her mother had explained Patch's story to her the day they moved to town, and Emma had immediately appointed herself his official blanket keeper. Dr. Martinez, the local veterinarian, had his own secret mission. Every few months, in the deep hours of the night when Patch finally succumbed to exhaustion, the vet would quietly approach with his medical bag. With gentle hands and practiced movements, he'd check the sleeping dog's vital signs and administer necessary vaccines. Sometimes he'd leave vitamin supplements hidden in special treats, making sure Patch stayed as healthy as possible despite his outdoor life. The town itself seemed to flow and change around Patch's steadfast presence like a river around a boulder. Where Mr. Donnelly's hardware store had once stood, a sleek coffee shop now served lattes to young professionals. The old bookstore had transformed into a yoga studio, its windows filled with people stretching on colorful mats where dusty shelves had once lived. Yet through all these changes, Patch remained constant. His vigil had become such a fixed part of the street that new shop owners simply worked around him. The coffee shop's owner made sure their morning deliveries never disturbed his rest. The yoga studio's patrons learned to step carefully around his spot, some leaving small offerings of food or gentle pats on their way past. During a heated city council meeting, Councilman Bradford stood at the podium waving a stack of papers. "The building is an eyesore," he declared, his voice sharp with authority. "It's bringing down property values and attracting vermin. We need to move forward with demolition." Mrs. Callahan, her silver hair neatly pinned back, rose slowly from her seat. Though her voice was quiet, it carried the weight of years. "That shop is more than just a building," she said, her hands clasped firmly before her. "It's a symbol of loyalty and hope. Patch has taught our children more about faithfulness than any lesson in school ever could." Mia, no longer the teenager who had first started bringing water to Patch, stood next to Mrs. Callahan. Now working as a journalist for the local paper, she'd grown into a confident young woman. "I've documented over 50 stories from families in this town about how Patch has affected their lives," she announced, holding up a thick notebook. "New families moving in learn about him and become part of this ongoing story of devotion. You can't put a price on that kind of community spirit." The council chamber erupted in murmurs of agreement. Other residents stood to share their own stories about Patch, how he'd comforted their children after bad days at school, how his presence had given them strength during their own difficult times. The demolition proposal was tabled indefinitely. As seasons continued their eternal cycle, Patch's story wove itself deeper into the fabric of the town's identity. Parents would pause with their children in front of the shop, pointing out the faded Patch's Place sign and sharing the tale of the dog who never gave up. New residents would hear the story from neighbors, each telling, adding another layer to the quiet legend. On a cool evening in late autumn, Patch struggled to rise from his resting spot. His legs trembled with the effort, age and weariness finally showing their full effect. Several passers-by paused, concerned, but Patch's determination remained unbroken. With painful slowness, he dragged himself the few feet to his usual waiting spot by the door. Across the street, Mia was just finishing her shift at the corner cafe. Through the window, she watched Patch's labored movement, her heart catching in her throat. The sight of his struggle brought tears to her eyes, but she also felt a deep admiration for his unwavering spirit. Without hesitation, she hung up her apron and stepped out into the growing darkness. The street had quieted, most shops closed for the day. Her footsteps echoed softly as she crossed to where Patch lay, his breathing heavy but steady. Settling herself on the cold pavement beside him, Mia gently stroked his graying fur. "You're still watching, aren't you?" she whispered. Patch's tail thumped weakly against the ground, his eyes fixed on the familiar street as stars began to appear in the darkening sky above. Together, they sat in companionable silence, watching as the first stars emerged. The evening air grew cooler, but Mia stayed, sharing her warmth with the faithful dog who had become such an important part of their community's heart. Leo shifted his duffel bag to his other shoulder as he walked down Main Street, his free hand clutching a worn leather tool roll. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the weight of his few possessions reminded him just how much he was starting from scratch. In his back pocket, a carefully folded letter crinkled with each step, official confirmation of the small business grant that had brought him to this quiet town. His boots scuffed against the concrete as he took in the mix of old and new storefronts. A modern coffee shop with gleaming windows stood next to a faded drugstore that looked unchanged since the 1950s. But it was the building at the end of the block that made him pause mid-stride. Thick vines crawled up its brick walls, and dusty windows reflected the morning light like aged mirrors. The facade had a quiet dignity despite its decay, the kind of solid craftsmanship that spoke of better days. A weathered wooden sign reading Patch's Place hung crookedly above the door. What really caught Leo's attention, though, was the old dog curled up by the entrance. Its gray muzzle rested on crossed paws, and despite obvious age, there was something noble in the way it held itself. The dog's eyes, clear and alert, followed Leo's movement with quiet intelligence. "Morning there," Leo said softly, keeping his distance out of respect. The dog's tail thumped once against the ground in acknowledgement, but it made no move to approach or retreat. A bell chimed behind him, and Leo turned to see a young woman stepping out of the corner cafe carrying a steaming cup of coffee. She noticed him studying the old shop and smiled warmly. "You must be new in town," she said, walking over. "I'm Mia, that's Patch." She nodded toward the dog, who gave another gentle tail thump at the sound of his name. "Leo," he replied, extending his hand. "Just got in this morning. There's something about this place." He gestured toward the shop, trying to put his finger on what drew him to it. Mia's expression softened. "That's Sam Rivers' old woodworking shop. There's quite a story there if you're interested. Why don't you come inside? I'm just starting my break." Leo followed her into the cafe, setting his bags down beside a worn wooden table. The smell of coffee and fresh-baked muffins filled the air. As Mia went to get him a cup of coffee, an older man at the counter turned at the mention of Sam's name. "Talking about the old shop, are you?" The man's voice was gruff but not unkind. He picked up his coffee and joined them, pulling out a chair. "Name's Donnelly. Used to own the hardware store before all these fancy coffee places took over." "Mr. Donnelly knows the story better than anyone," Mia said, returning with Leo's coffee. "He and Sam were friends for years." Donnelly snorted softly. "Wouldn't say friends exactly, more like we understood each other. Sam was a craftsman of the old school. Quiet man, kept to himself mostly, except for that dog." "Patch," Leo said, glancing out the window, where he could still see the dog's faithful silhouette. "That's right." Donnelly wrapped his weathered hands around his coffee cup. "Sam found him as a stray years ago. Never saw two beings take to each other quite like that. Patch would spend every day watching Sam work through those windows, tail wagging every time Sam looked his way." Mia leaned forward, her voice softening. "Then one night, almost 8 years ago now, Sam got a phone call. He left in his truck during a bad storm. There was an accident on the highway." She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "Patch has been waiting at that door every day since," Donnelly finished. "Through snow, rain, heat, doesn't matter. Local folks look after him, but he won't leave that spot. Turned down every attempt to give him a proper home." Leo stared into his coffee, something tightening in his chest. "And the shop? Just sits empty?" "City councils tried to condemn it a few times," Donnelly said, a hint of pride entering his voice. "But the community won't hear of it. That dog's loyalty means something to people around here. Reminds them of what matters." Leo pulled out his grant letter, smoothing it on the table. "I actually came here looking for a place to set up my own workshop. I'm a furniture maker. Learned from my grandfather." His fingers traced the official letterhead. "The grant's not much, but it's enough to get started somewhere." Mia and Donnelly exchanged a look. "The old Rivers place has been tied up in legal limbo since Sam disappeared," Donnelly said slowly. "No will, no next of kin came forward. But," he scratched his chin thoughtfully, "town council's been talking about finding someone to take over the lease. Fix it up proper. Keep it as a working shop. Honor what it means to folks around here." Leo's heart beat a little faster. He reached into his wallet and carefully extracted a worn photograph, laying it on the table. It showed an old man standing proudly beside a massive woodworking bench, tools arranged with loving precision on the wall behind him. "My grandfather's workshop," Leo explained quietly. "He taught me everything I know about woodworking. Passed away before I could really show him what I'd learned. But he always said a good workshop had soul. You could feel the care that went into every piece made there." He looked out the window again at the old shop, at Patch's faithful vigil. "I felt something like that when I saw this place. Like it's waiting for someone to bring the soul back." Later that night, Leo sat cross-legged on his bed in the small room he'd rented above the drugstore. Sketches of furniture designs were spread around him. Clean, simple lines, that echoed the craftsmanship he'd learned at his grandfather's bench. The photograph of his grandfather's workshop sat propped against the lamp, the old man's kind eyes seeming to watch over Leo's work. A movement outside caught his attention. Through the window, he watched as Patch made his way slowly down the darkened street. The old dog's limp was more pronounced in the evening hours, but his determination never wavered. With careful dignity, Patch settled into his spot by the shop door, his silhouette a darker shadow against the night. Leo's pencil paused over his sketchbook as he watched, feeling the weight of history and loyalty in that simple act of faith. The blank lease application form lay on his nightstand, waiting for his decision. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of City Hall as Leo shifted his weight from one foot to the other, pen hovering over the final line of the lease agreement. The office smelled of coffee and old paper, and the ancient ceiling fan clicked rhythmically overhead. "You understand the condition of the property?" Mrs. Henderson, the town clerk, peered at him over her reading glasses. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and concern creased her forehead. "The building inspector's report lists numerous violations. The electrical needs complete updating. The roof has several weak spots, and there's likely water damage in the walls." "I understand," Leo said, his voice steady despite the flutter of nervousness in his stomach. He glanced at Mr. Donnelly, who had come along as a character reference and now stood by the window, arms crossed. "The boy knows what he's getting into, Martha," Donnelly said gruffly. "He's got skills, and that place needs someone who'll treat it right." Mrs. Henderson sighed, shuffling through the stack of papers. "Well, the council did approve the special historical designation, which means you can begin repairs without meeting all current codes immediately." She tapped a paragraph with her pen. "But you'll need to show consistent progress toward bringing everything up to standard within 18 months. Leo nodded, scanning the terms one final time. The grant money would barely cover the first few months' rent and essential repairs. But he had savings. And more importantly, he had a vision of what the old shop could become. "Sign here, here, and initial these pages," Mrs. Henderson instructed, pointing to various spots on the document. Leo's signature flowed across the paper, each stroke making it more real. When he finished, she handed him a ring of old brass keys. "The property is yours, Mr. Mason. Good luck." The walk to the shop seemed both longer and shorter than usual. The morning air was crisp, and shopkeepers were just beginning to open their stores. Leo's footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, the keys jingling softly in his pocket. As he approached, he saw Patch in his usual spot by the door. The old dog's eyes tracked his movement, but there was no hostility in his gaze, just the same patient watchfulness he showed everyone. "Morning, Patch," Leo said softly. "Guess we're going to be neighbors now." The largest key took some wiggling before the lock finally turned with a rusty groan. The door stuck slightly, and Leo had to put his shoulder into it. As it swung open, a wave of musty air washed over him, carrying the complex scents of aged wood, metal, and decades of work. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. Leo stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. The space was smaller than it looked from outside, but every inch spoke of purpose and craft. Tools hung on pegboard walls in precise arrangements, their shadows forming ghost outlines where missing pieces had once hung. Workbenches lined both walls, their surfaces scarred and stained with the evidence of countless projects. At the far end, a massive lathe sat like a sleeping giant draped in cobwebs. Leo set his toolbox down carefully and began opening windows. Each one required careful attention. Some had been painted shut years ago, others were swollen in their frames. But gradually fresh air began to circulate through the shop. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Patch had moved to watch from just inside the doorway. The dog settled onto his haunches, head tilted slightly as if evaluating Leo's work. "Just trying to let some light in," Leo explained, though he felt slightly foolish talking to a dog. "Place needs to breathe again." He found an old broom in a corner and began sweeping, working methodically from the back of the shop forward. The dust was thick enough in places to require several passes. Beneath it, the wooden floor revealed its original warm tones. As he worked, Leo discovered small traces of the life that had once filled this space. A flannel shirt hung forgotten on a coat hook, its red and black plaid faded but still visible through the dust. A cracked coffee mug sat on a shelf. "World's OKest Boss," barely legible on its side. In one corner, he found a stack of project sketches, the pencil lines still sharp under their coating of grime. Several pieces sat unfinished on the workbenches, a chair missing its back slats, a small table with only 3 legs attached, a jewelry box with its lid half-carved. Each one spoke of interrupted work, of plans left hanging when Sam drove away that stormy night. The afternoon light had shifted to amber when Leo noticed the sagging floorboards near the main workbench. He knelt down, pressing with his hands to test the give. The boards moved more than they should, but it wasn't rot. The movement felt wrong for that. Using a pry bar from his toolbox, Leo carefully lifted the loose boards. The hollow sound when his tool hit wood made him pause. Beneath the flooring, tucked against one of the support beams, he found a drawer built into the structure itself. It was a craftsman's secret compartment, the kind of detail only another woodworker might think to look for. The drawer stuck slightly as he eased it out. Inside, he found stacks of leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with Sam's neat handwriting, recording jobs, costs, and customer notes. Beneath these was a folder of sketches, furniture designs, architectural details, and what looked like toys. And there, wrapped carefully in a soft cloth, lay a half-finished wooden boat. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Even unfinished, Leo could see the care in every curve and joint. A small paper tag was tied to the stern with twine, the name Maddie written in careful letters. Leo lifted the boat gently, feeling the smoothness of the wood under his fingers. Dust sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the newly cleaned windows, and for a moment the shop seemed to hold its breath. From his spot by the door, Patch watched silently as Leo cradled this fragment of Sam's unfinished story in his hands. Leo pulled his chair closer to the workbench, now cleared of decades of dust and debris. The afternoon light streamed through the freshly cleaned windows, casting long shadows across the scattered papers before him. He had arranged the documents from the hidden drawer in neat piles, each telling its own piece of Sam's story. The appointment book spoke of a thriving business. Detailed notes about custom furniture orders, delivery dates, and client preferences filled every page in Sam's precise handwriting. Materials lists showed a craftsman who knew exactly what he needed for each project, down to the last screw and finishing oil. His fingers traced over the toy boat commission form. The customer details were sparse, just Maddie's boat and a deposit amount. No last name, no address. The design sketch showed a beautiful sailboat with intricate details that would have taken weeks to complete. But it was the stack of medical receipts that made Leo's heart sink. They were crumpled and coffee-stained, as if Sam had shoved them hastily into his pocket. Each one dated within days of his disappearance. Specialist consultations, imaging services, laboratory work. The amounts were staggering, especially for someone running a small woodworking shop. "This doesn't make sense," Leo muttered to himself. Patch, who had taken to sleeping near the door while Leo worked, lifted his head at the sound. Why would a healthy man suddenly need so many medical tests? Leo gathered the most important documents into a folder. The evening was settling, but the cafe where Mia worked was open late. He needed another perspective, someone who knew Sam before he vanished. The bell above the cafe door chimed as Leo entered. The warm aroma of coffee and fresh-baked cookies filled the air. A few regular customers sat at their usual tables, nursing cups of tea and reading newspapers. Mia looked up from wiping down the counter, her face brightening with recognition. "Leo, I was wondering when you'd surface from all that cleaning." She noticed the serious expression on his face. "Everything okay? Can you take a break?" "I found something in the shop that doesn't add up." Mia glanced at the clock, then called to the kitchen. "Jenny, I'm taking 15. She untied her apron and led Leo to a quiet corner table. Leo spread out the medical receipts. These were hidden under the floorboards with some other papers, all from the week before Sam disappeared. Mia's brow furrowed as she examined the dates. "But that's impossible. I saw Sam that week. He was fine. He was working on Mrs. Peterson's dining room set. I remember because he let me watch him turning the chair legs on the lathe." "You're sure? No signs of illness?" "None." Mia shook her head firmly. "He was as healthy as ever, maybe a little tired, but he always worked long hours." She picked up one of the receipts, squinting at the hospital name. "This place is 2 towns over. Why would he go so far for tests when we have a perfectly good hospital here?" Leo pulled out a notepad. "We need to track his movements that last week. There must be something we're missing. What else do you remember?" Mia closed her eyes, thinking back. "He was at the hardware store on Tuesday. Mr. Donnelly mentioned they had a long chat about some special wood glue Sam needed. Wednesday evening, he played fetch with Patch in the alley like always. Thursday, ... She paused. Thursday was when he got that phone call." "What phone call?" "I was walking home from school. Sam was standing in the doorway of the shop, holding the phone. He looked tense. That was the last time I saw him." They spent the next hour brainstorming possible leads. Utility bills might show if Sam's power usage changed suddenly. Local businesses might remember his last purchases. But it was Mia who thought of the pawn shops. "Sam treasured his tools," she explained. "If he suddenly needed money, maybe for these medical bills, that's the only thing valuable enough he could have sold quickly." The next morning, Leo drove to every pawn shop within 20 miles. The first 3 were dead ends, but the fourth, a cramped store wedged between a laundromat and a vacant lot, made his heart race. The bell jangled as he entered. The shelves were crowded with the usual pawn shop fare: old electronics, jewelry, musical instruments. But in the corner, he spotted a familiar sight: a set of wood chisels, their handles worn smooth from years of use. The owner emerged from the back room, an elderly man with thick glasses and suspenders. "Help you find something?" Leo pointed to the chisels. "Those tools, they wouldn't happen to be from Sam Rivers, would they?" The old man's expression shifted. "You know Sam? Haven't thought about him in years. Shame what happened, or didn't happen. Nobody ever figured it out. You remember when he brought these in? Like it was yesterday. Stormy night, maybe 9 years back. Sam came in just before closing. Had his whole collection of specialty tools. Stuff you can't even buy anymore. Premium quality, maintained perfect." The owner shook his head. "Broke my heart to see him sell them. Could tell they meant the world to him." "Did he say anything about why he needed the money?" The old man adjusted his glasses. Not directly, but something was eating at him. Hands were shaking when he counted the cash. Said something about making things right, and before it's too late. Never seen him so rattled, like something bad was coming. He paused, remembering. Tried to talk him into just pawning them, holding them a few months instead of selling outright. But he insisted, said he wouldn't be back. Leo studied the chisels behind the glass. The tools that had shaped countless pieces of furniture, brought beauty out of raw wood, now sat gathering dust in a pawnshop display. "How much?" he asked. The owner named a price that made Leo wince, but he pulled out his wallet anyway. These tools belonged back in Sam's shop, even if Sam himself wasn't there to use them. But as the owner wrapped the chisels in brown paper, he added, "You know, I always wondered about that night. Man doesn't just sell his livelihood without a real good reason, or a real bad one." Leo carried the wrapped tools back to his truck, his mind racing. The medical bills, the urgent phone call, the sold tools, pieces of a puzzle that still didn't fit together. But he was more determined than ever to uncover the truth behind Sam's disappearance. Leo's truck rumbled to a stop outside the shop as evening settled over the quiet street. The old chisels sat wrapped in brown paper on the passenger seat. A tangible piece of Sam's past finally returned home. His muscles ached from the long day of driving between pawnshops, but his mind buzzed with possibilities and questions. As he climbed out of the truck, something different caught his attention. Patch, who had kept a careful distance since Leo took over the shop, was slowly making his way toward him. The old dog's gray muzzle and slight limp showed his age, but his eyes remained bright and alert. Leo stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. This felt important somehow, like a moment of trust being offered. Patch came right up to him and sat down, looking up with those patient eyes that had watched this doorway for so many years. "Hey there, old friend," Leo said softly, slowly extending his hand. Patch leaned forward, sniffing Leo's fingers, then pressed his head against Leo's palm. The fur behind his ears was soft and slightly matted. Leo gently scratched the spot, and Patch's tail thumped against the concrete. "You've been waiting a long time, haven't you?" Leo's voice was thick with emotion. Here was this faithful creature who had never given up, who had guarded this place through rain and snow and changing seasons. "We'll find him, old guy. I promise." Patch's tail thumped harder at the gentle words. For the first time since Leo had arrived, the dog followed him into the shop instead of staying by the door. Leo unwrapped the chisels and carefully placed them back in their rightful place on the tool wall. Patch watched the whole process as if he recognized these pieces of his old life returning home. The medical bills were still spread across the workbench where Leo had left them. He picked one up, studying the hospital name and dates again. A plan was forming in his mind. If Sam had needed serious medical care, there would be records somewhere. Social services might be able to help track them down. Early the next morning, Leo started making calls. Each conversation led to another department, another transfer, another dead end. His notepad filled with names and case numbers that went nowhere. By afternoon, his voice was hoarse from repeating Sam's details over and over. "Yes, Samuel Rivers. Disappeared about 8 years ago. No missing persons report was ever filed. Yes, I have medical records from right before he vanished. No, I'm not a relative, but..." Most calls ended there. Privacy laws meant no one could share information with a non-family member. Leo's frustration grew with each disconnected call, but he kept dialing. Someone had to know something. Finally, around 4 o'clock, he reached Linda Martinez, a social worker who had been in the system long enough to remember cases from that time period. Her voice was tired but kind as she listened to Leo's story. "Wait a minute," she said suddenly. 8 years ago, you said? Let me check something." Keys clicked in the background as she searched her files. "We had a John Doe case back then. Veteran unconscious after a bad crash on Highway 23. No ID on him, but they found a military service card in his coat." "Hold on." Leo's heart pounded as he heard more typing. "Highway 23. That was the road that led out of town, the one where they'd found Sam's wrecked truck. "Here it is," Linda said. Male, early 60s, brought in with severe head trauma. They couldn't identify him at first because the swelling was so bad. By the time he stabilized enough for proper identification, he was already transferred to long-term care. "Where?" Leo's voice cracked. "Where did they send him?" "Riverside Care Center, about 2 counties over." "Let me see if—" "Yes, he's still listed as a current resident." More typing. Looking at the notes. Limited verbal communication, some memory issues, but physically stable. They never made the connection to any missing persons cases, because technically, no one ever reported him missing. Leo's hand shook as he scribbled down the address. "You're sure he's still there? Still alive?" "According to their latest update, yes. He's definitely alive." Linda paused. "Listen, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but if you're trying to help someone who's been lost this long, maybe you should go see for yourself. Visiting hours are until 7. Leo stared at the phone long after Linda hung up, his mind struggling to process what he'd just learned. Sam was alive. All these years, while his shop gathered dust and Patch kept his faithful vigil, Sam had been lying in a hospital bed just 2 hours away. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The medical bills, the urgent phone call, the sold tools. Sam must have received some devastating diagnosis that sent him driving into the storm that night. Instead of whatever illness he feared, it was the crash that had taken him away. Leo's hands trembled as he wrote down the hospital's address, Riverside Care Center. After 8 years of mystery, the answer had been sitting in a social worker's database all along. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, the same hook where Sam's old flannel shirt still hung. Patch lifted his head from his spot near the workbench, those wise old eyes following Leo's movements. The dog had never given up hope, had never stopped believing Sam would return. Now, finally, that faith might be rewarded. Leo turned to Patch, his voice gentle but urgent. "Come on, boy, it's time." The old dog stood slowly, his arthritic joints creaking, but his tail began to wag. Something in Leo's tone must have conveyed the importance of this moment. They stood together in the doorway of the shop, the young craftsman who had inherited this space and the faithful dog who had guarded it for so long. Both of them sensing they were on the verge of uncovering the truth that had eluded everyone for 8 long years. The morning mist clung low to the streets as Leo gathered what they needed for the journey. He'd woken before dawn, too anxious to sleep, and spent an hour pacing the shop floor before finally loading up the truck. Now, with the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, he carefully arranged several warm blankets across the passenger seat, creating a soft nest. Patch watched from his usual spot by the door, head tilted slightly as if trying to understand this break in routine. The old dog had grown slower over the years, his muzzle now completely gray, but his eyes still held that same patient intelligence that had earned him the town's devotion. "Come on, buddy," Leo called softly, patting the blankets. "Time for a little road trip." Patch hesitated, looking back at his post by the door. For 8 years, he'd barely moved from that spot, keeping his endless vigil. Leo's heart ached, understanding the dog's reluctance to leave the place where he'd waited so long for Sam's return. "Trust me," Leo said, kneeling down to Patch's level. "Please." Something in his voice must have convinced the old dog. Patch limped forward, allowing Leo to gently lift him into the truck. His joints were stiff, and Leo took extra care positioning him comfortably on the blankets. Once settled, Patch turned those wise eyes toward Leo, as if saying he was ready. Leo climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The truck's familiar rumble filled the quiet morning air. As they pulled away from the shop, he caught Patch looking back through the rear window, watching his post disappear into the morning mist. The town slowly came to life around them as they drove through the streets. Early risers were just beginning their days, Mr. Donnelly unlocking the hardware store, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery, newspaper carriers tossing rolled papers onto dewy lawns. Leo wondered how many of them remembered Sam, how many had watched Patch's unwavering loyalty over the years. Once they hit the highway, the miles began to roll by steadily. Patch remained surprisingly calm for a dog who hadn't left his post in nearly a decade. He dozed occasionally, but mostly stayed alert, his cloudy eyes taking in the changing landscape outside the window. Every now and then, he would let out a soft whine, but it seemed more from anticipation than distress. Leo found himself talking, filling the quiet cab with stories as they drove. He told Patch about his grandfather's workshop, where he'd first learned to love the smell of sawdust and the feel of worn tools in his hands. He described the pieces he hoped to build in Sam's shop, the ways he planned to honor its history while bringing new life to the space. "You should have seen the dining table my grandfather made for my parents' wedding," Leo said, glancing at his furry passenger. "Oak, with these hand-carved leaves around the edges. Took him months to get it just right. That's the kind of work Sam did too, wasn't it? I can tell from the pieces I found in the shop. That unfinished boat, the detail work on the bow was incredible." Patch's tail thumped gently against the blankets at the mention of Sam's name. Leo reached over to scratch behind his ears, careful to keep one hand steady on the wheel. Around mid-morning, they pulled into a small gas station to refuel and stretch. Leo filled an old bowl with fresh water, which Patch lapped at slowly. The dog showed little interest in the treats Leo offered, but he did take a few careful steps around the parking lot, his arthritic legs seeming to loosen up a bit in the warm sun. Several other customers stopped to pet Patch, drawn by his gentle demeanor and gray muzzle. An elderly woman with kind eyes offered him a piece of her breakfast sandwich, which he politely declined. "Such a sweet old fellow," she said to Leo. "How long have you had him?" "He's not really mine," Leo replied, watching Patch make his way back to the truck. "I'm just helping him find someone he's been waiting for." Back on the road, the landscape gradually changed from rural farmland to more developed areas. Signs for the hospital started appearing, making Leo's heart beat faster. Patch seemed to sense the growing tension, sitting up straighter in his seat and watching the road ahead intently. Finally, the hospital complex came into view, a sprawling collection of brick buildings connected by covered walkways. Leo followed the signs to the long-term care facility, pulling into a spot near the entrance. His hands shook slightly as he turned off the engine. "We're here, boy," he said softly. "Let's go find him." Leo helped Patch out of the truck, supporting some of the old dog's weight as they made their way to the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a blast of cool air that carried the distinct hospital smell, antiseptic and paper, and something indefinably institutional. At the front desk, a receptionist looked up from her computer. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Patch, but before she could object, Leo quickly explained, "Please, we're here to see Samuel Rivers. Room 214? It's very important." She checked her computer, then made a quick phone call. After a brief conversation, she nodded. "A nurse will be right down to escort you." They waited in the lobby, Patch sitting patiently, despite his obvious fatigue from the journey. A few minutes later, a nurse in blue scrubs appeared. She introduced herself as Marie, and after a gentle pat for Patch, led them down a series of quiet hallways. The long-term care wing was peaceful, with soft lighting and artwork on the walls. Occasionally, they passed other patients in wheelchairs or walking slowly with assistance. Each one smiled at the sight of Patch, who acknowledged them with dignified nods. "Here we are," Marie said finally, stopping outside room 214. "He's been having a good morning, but please remember, he may not be exactly as you remember him." Leo took a deep breath, his hand resting on Patch's head for support. Then he stepped into the room, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The morning sun streamed through half-drawn blinds, casting strips of light across the linoleum floor. Medical equipment beeped softly in the corner. And there, propped up in the bed, was a thin, bearded man staring vacantly at the ceiling. His hair had gone completely white, his face lined with age and marked by old scars. But Leo recognized him from the photographs he'd found in the shop. Sam Rivers, lost for 8 years, had finally been found. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the gentle click of Patch's nails on the linoleum floor. Leo stood in the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took in the scene before him. The morning sunlight filtered through half-drawn blinds, casting alternating strips of light and shadow across the room. Marie, the nurse, stepped back without a word, understanding the delicate nature of the moment. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound as she retreated, leaving Leo and Patch alone with the man they'd traveled so far to find. Sam Rivers lay propped up in the hospital bed, his thin frame barely making a dent in the mattress. His once dark hair had turned completely white, matching the scraggly beard that covered his hollow cheeks. Old scars marked his face, remnants of the accident that had brought him here. But it was the vacant look in his eyes that made Leo's chest tighten. Those eyes, fixed on the ceiling, showed no awareness of the visitors who had just entered his room. Leo took a deep breath, steadying himself. The smell of antiseptic and clean linens filled his lungs, so different from the familiar sense of wood and varnish that still lingered in Sam's old shop. Patch pressed against his leg, offering silent support, and Leo drew strength from the old dog's presence. Together, they moved closer to the bed. The morning sun caught the silver threads in Patch's fur, highlighting just how much time had passed since that stormy night when Sam had disappeared. The dog's movements were slow and careful, his arthritic legs carrying him forward with determined dignity. Leo cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle Sam. The older man didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze remained fixed on some distant point only he could see. His hands lay motionless on top of the white hospital blanket. Fingers curved slightly, as if they still remembered the shape of long-absent tools. "Mr. Rivers?" Leo's voice came out gentle, barely above a whisper. "My name is Leo. I'm the new tenant in your old workshop." No response. Not even a flicker of recognition crossed Sam's weathered face. Leo pressed on, his words careful and measured. "The shop is still there, Mr. Rivers. It's been standing all this time, waiting just like—" He glanced down at the patient dog beside him. "Just like Patch has been waiting." At the sound of that name, those 5 simple letters that held 8 years of unwavering loyalty, something changed. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Leo saw it. Sam's fingers twitched against the blanket, a tiny movement that spoke volumes in the stillness of the room. Patch noticed too. His ears perked forward, and his tail gave the slightest wag. With the same patience he'd shown through years of waiting, the old dog moved closer to the bed. His nose extended carefully, taking in the scent of the man he'd waited so long to see again. Leo watched, hardly daring to breathe, as Patch sniffed Sam's hand. The dog's gray muzzle moved slowly, deliberately, reacquainting himself with a scent that must have lived only in his memory for so long. Then, with infinite gentleness, Patch lowered his head and rested it against Sam's fingers. The touch seemed to send a current through Sam's body. His fingers trembled, then slowly, so slowly, curled inward, brushing against Patch's fur. The vacant look in his eyes began to shift, like clouds parting after a long storm. "I found your records," Leo continued softly, encouraged by these small signs of awareness. "The shop's ledgers, the unfinished projects. There's a toy boat there, waiting to be completed. And Patch, he's been there every day, Mr. Rivers. Every single day since you left." Sam's lips moved, though no sound emerged at first. His throat worked, struggling to form words that hadn't been spoken in years. When his voice finally came, it was a hoarse whisper, rough with disuse and heavy with disbelief. "Patch waited." The words hung in the air, fragile as spider silk. Leo felt tears spill down his cheeks, unable to hold them back any longer. He nodded, watching as Patch lifted his head slightly at the sound of his old friend's voice. The old dog moved closer, his movements slow but deliberate. With a soft sigh that seemed to release 8 years of patient waiting, Patch carefully laid his head across Sam's lap. The gesture was both familiar and new, a reunion that bridged the gap of lost years with simple, unconditional love. Sam's hand trembled as it moved to rest on Patch's head, fingers finding their place behind the dog's ears as if they'd never forgotten where they belonged. Tears began to slip down the older man's cheeks, cutting shining trails through the morning sunlight. The hospital administrator, Ms. Chen, listened carefully as Leo explained his request. Her eyes softened when he described Patch's years of faithful waiting. After consulting with the head nurse and reviewing hospital policies, she made an exception. Patch would be allowed to stay during visiting hours, provided he remained calm and didn't disturb other patients. "Thank you," Leo said, relief evident in his voice. "This means everything." The next morning, Leo arrived early with Patch, carrying a small cushion he'd found in the shop's storage. He placed it near Sam's bed, creating a comfortable spot for the old dog. Patch settled in immediately, his eyes never leaving Sam's face. Throughout that first day, Leo worked on his laptop, answering emails about custom furniture orders while sitting in the vinyl hospital chair. Every few hours, he'd take Patch for short walks in the hospital's small courtyard, but the dog was always eager to return to room 214. The routine quickly fell into place. Leo would arrive each morning as the sun was rising, Patch padding quietly beside him through the hospital corridors. He'd work from his truck when needed, making phone calls and running essential errands, but he always returned before evening. Visiting hours ended. Sam's recovery was slow, like ice melting in early spring. The first changes were subtle, his eyes following movement in the room, his fingers twitching when Patch nuzzled his hand. The nurses noticed he slept more peacefully with Patch nearby, his heart rate steadier, his breathing more relaxed. On the 4th day during morning rounds, Sam spoke his second complete sentence since Leo had found him. "Need my tools," he whispered, his voice still rough from disuse. Leo's heart leaped. That afternoon, he brought in a small collection of whittling knives and a piece of soft pine. The physical therapist, Derek, incorporated them into their sessions, helping Sam grip the familiar handles. "Muscle memory is powerful," Derek explained as he guided Sam's hands. "These movements might help wake up neural pathways that have gone dormant." Leo watched as Sam's weathered fingers trembled around the knife handle. Patch lifted his head from his cushion, ears perked forward with interest. The first few attempts produced only awkward scratches in the wood, but Sam's determination was evident in the set of his jaw. Each day brought small victories. Sam began feeding himself with more confidence. His sentences, though still brief, became more frequent. The vacant look in his eyes gradually gave way to awareness, especially when Leo talked about the shop or brought in pictures of projects he was working on. "The lathe," Sam murmured one evening, touching a photo of his old workbench. "Still works." "Needs some oil and new bearings," Leo replied. "But she's solid, built to last." A ghost of a smile crossed Sam's face, the first Leo had seen. The physical therapy sessions grew longer as Sam's strength improved. Derek worked with him on grip exercises, using both medical equipment and woodworking tools. Patch watched each session intently from his cushion, tail thumping whenever Sam achieved a new milestone. Leo began bringing in wood shavings from the shop, letting them fall through Sam's fingers. The familiar texture and scent seemed to trigger something deep in his memory. His hands would move automatically, as if planing invisible boards or measuring unseen joints. "Maple," he'd whisper, running his fingers through the curls of wood. "Or oak." "Cherry," Leo would sometimes answer. "Or walnut," watching Sam's nose twitch as he confirmed the scents he'd known for decades. The nurses grew used to finding small piles of wood shavings on the floor, sweeping them up without complaint. They commented on how the room had started to smell like a workshop instead of a hospital, a change they welcomed. 2 weeks into their new routine, on a quiet Tuesday evening, Sam had his best therapy session yet. He'd managed to whittle a rough but recognizable bird shape from a piece of basswood, his hands steadier than they'd been since Leo found him. "Good work today, Sam," Derek said as he packed up his equipment. "Rest well." Leo stayed a bit longer than usual, watching as Sam's eyes grew heavy. Patch was curled up on the bed near Sam's feet, a privilege the nurses had begun allowing as Sam's condition improved. The old dog's breathing was deep and even, matching his master's rhythm. "See you tomorrow," Leo said softly, standing to leave. Sam nodded slightly, his hand resting on Patch's back, fingers gently tangled in the dog's fur. The night shift nurse, Maria, made her final rounds just before midnight. She noted how peaceful they looked, the old carpenter and his faithful dog, both sleeping soundly in the quiet room. The monitoring equipment beeped steadily, and the moon cast a gentle glow through the window. When Maria returned at dawn for her final check before her shift ended, she paused in the doorway. Something about the stillness in the room made her heart catch. Sam was still sleeping, his face relaxed, one hand resting gently on Patch's fur. But Patch was too still, his chest no longer rising and falling with breath. The old dog lay exactly where he'd settled the night before, his head resting on Sam's blanket. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful, as if he'd simply decided that after 8 years of faithful waiting, he could finally rest. He had found his person again, completed his mission, and let go with quiet dignity. Maria stood for a moment, tears welling in her eyes. In her years of nursing, she'd witnessed many endings, but something about this one, about the loyalty and love it represented, touched her deeply. She watched Sam's chest rise and fall with sleep, his hand still resting protectively on his old friend's fur, unaware yet that during the night, Patch had slipped away to wait for him somewhere else. She turned away quietly, heading to the nurse's station to make the necessary calls. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pink and gold, marking the start of a new day. The morning after Patch died, Leo found Sam staring at the empty cushion where his dog had lain. The nurses had removed the body, but Sam's hand still rested where Patch's fur had been. "I'm so sorry, Sam," Leo said quietly. Sam eventually whispered, "He waited all those years." "He never gave up on you. Now I'd like to help give him a proper goodbye." Leo arranged with Ms. Chen for a burial plot beneath an oak tree visible from Sam's window. The groundskeeper, Robert, volunteered to dig the grave in a spot where wildflowers grew between the roots. Leo crafted a wooden box from pieces of the old maple workbench Patch had guarded. On burial day, Leo helped Sam dress in his own clothes for the first time in weeks. Though weak, Sam transferred to the wheelchair with minimal help. Leo wheeled him through the hospital and outside, Sam's first breath of fresh air in nearly a decade. Robert, Ms. Chen, Derek, and several nurses gathered at the grave. Sam touched the wooden box and finally spoke. "Good dog. Best friend I ever had." Leo placed a stone marker with Patch's name at the gravesite, and they stayed after others left, under the rustling oak. In subsequent weeks, Sam grew stronger, pushing himself harder in therapy. He progressed from parallel bars to a walker to a cane, walking farther down the corridor each day. He began asking detailed questions about his shop and tools. "I need to finish things," he told Leo. "Projects waiting." Leo prepared for Sam's homecoming, filing paperwork, installing safety features in the shop, and arranging the workspace for Sam's mobility needs. Mrs. Callahan stocked the kitchen, while Mr. Donnelly donated new lights. On release day, Sam wore his old work boots with his cane nearby. After completing discharge formalities, Leo helped him to the waiting pickup. As they drove away, Sam watched the oak tree disappear from view and whispered, "Almost home, Patch." Leo eased the truck to a stop in front of the old carpentry shop. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk, highlighting the weathered facade of the building. Thick vines had claimed much of the exterior, their tendrils creeping across weathered boards and around window frames. Above the door, the carved wooden sign, Patch's Place, still hung, its letters faded but legible against the aged wood. Sam sat motionless in the passenger seat for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping his cane. His eyes, bright with unshed tears, took in every detail of the familiar storefront. "Take your time," Leo said softly, killing the engine. Moving carefully around to the passenger side, Leo opened the door and offered his arm for support. Sam's movements were deliberate as he shifted his legs out of the truck, testing his balance before attempting to stand. His knuckles whitened around the cane's handle as he pushed himself up, accepting Leo's steady presence beside him. The few steps to the shop entrance felt like miles to Sam. His breathing grew heavier with each careful movement, but determination showed in the set of his jaw. When they finally reached the door, Sam reached out with trembling fingers to touch the wooden sign, tracing the letters that countless hands had touched over the years. "Still here," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Leo pulled out the shop keys, their metal catching the sunlight. Together, they unlocked the heavy door, its hinges creaking in protest after years of minimal use. As the door swung open, particles of dust danced in the streams of sunlight that poured through the grimy windows. The interior looked frozen in time. Tools still hung on their pegs, though covered in dust. The massive workbench dominated the center of the room, its scarred surface telling stories of countless projects. The smell, that distinctive mixture of cedar, oil, and aged wood, filled their lungs. Sam moved forward slowly, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. When he reached the workbench, he let his free hand drift across its surface, fingers finding familiar nicks and grooves in the wood. His touch was reverent, like greeting an old friend. Leo watched quietly, giving Sam space to reconnect with his past. After a few minutes, he moved to a nearby shelf and carefully retrieved the unfinished toy boat they'd discovered in the hidden drawer. The wood had aged beautifully, taking on a rich patina that only time could create. "I found this," Leo said softly, placing the boat on the workbench. "It was in a drawer under the floor, along with some old papers. The tag says Maddie." Sam's fingers trembled as they touched the small vessel. "Never got to finish it," he murmured, his voice growing stronger. "Should make it right." "Would you like to finish it together?" Leo asked. Sam looked up, meeting Leo's eyes with newfound clarity. "Let's do it right," he said, his voice steady and sure for the first time since leaving the hospital. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm of restoration, both of the shop and of Sam himself. Each morning, they tackled a new project. Leo arrived early, always finding Sam already awake and ready to work, though his body's limitations often frustrated him. They started with the windows, carefully removing years of grime and replacing cracked panes. Sam supervised from a sturdy chair, offering guidance on technique and sharing stories about each window's history. "That one there," he'd say, pointing with his cane, "caught the morning light just right for detail work." The structural repairs came next. Leo checked every beam, replacing rotted sections, while Sam taught him the finer points of joining techniques. Though Sam couldn't climb the ladder himself, his knowledge guided Leo's hands, making each repair stronger than the last. The floors took the most time. They worked section by section, sanding away years of wear and neglect. Sam insisted on helping despite his limitations, sitting on a low stool to hand sand smaller areas, while Leo handled the larger sections with the power sander. By the end of each day, they were covered in dust, but the rich grain of the old wood emerged like buried treasure beneath their efforts. Leo never rushed Sam, understanding that each small task was part of a larger healing process. When Sam tired, they would take breaks, sitting together at the workbench while Sam shared stories about particular tools or memorable projects. Sometimes they worked in comfortable silence, the sounds of their tools speaking a language all their own. One afternoon, as golden light filled the freshly cleaned shop, they worked together to create a new sign. The original Patch's Place would stay above the door, a testament to years of faithful waiting. But beneath it, they carved Rivers and Company in clean, strong letters. Sam's hands, steadier now with practice, guided the chisel while Leo provided the strength to drive it through the wood. "Patch would have liked this," Sam said quietly as they hung the new sign. "He always did enjoy company." The town seemed to respond to the shop's revival. Neighbors who had helped care for Patch over the years stopped by to welcome Sam home. Mrs. Callahan brought fresh cookies and happy tears. Mr. Donnelly from the hardware store delivered a box of new tools with gruff good wishes. Even Mia, now running her own cafe down the street, made time to visit each afternoon with coffee and gentle conversation. Children began to pause on their way home from school, pressing their faces against the clean windows to watch Sam and Leo work. The sound of their laughter and excited chatter drifted in through the open door, bringing life back to the quiet street. One evening, as the sun began to set, Leo entered the shop to find Sam sitting at the workbench. A small chisel rested in his steady hands, poised over the toy boat that had waited so many years to be completed. The light caught the silver in Sam's hair and the fresh shavings on the workbench, creating a tableau of past and present merged into one moment. Sam looked up at Leo's entrance, a quiet peace in his expression. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we finish it." Outside, the sounds of the town drifted through the open door. Children's laughter, shop bells ringing, car doors closing, life moving forward. The street that had stood so still for so long was awakening again, as if Patch's long vigil had preserved not just the shop, but the heart of the community itself. Morning sunlight streamed through the freshly cleaned windows of Patch's Place, casting long golden rectangles across the worn wooden floor. The air was filled with the gentle sounds of careful work, the whisper of sandpaper, the soft tap of a chisel, and the occasional murmur of quiet conversation between Sam and Leo as they hunched over the workbench together. The toy boat that had waited so many years for completion now rested between them, its wood gleaming with fresh oil and care. Sam's hands, steadier after weeks of practice, guided a delicate chisel along the bow while Leo watched intently, ready to offer support if needed. "Just here," Sam murmured, his weathered fingers tracing a small area at the front of the vessel. "A flower like she wanted." Something special. Leo nodded, sliding a piece of scrap paper with a simple flower sketch closer to Sam. They had practiced the design several times the day before, making sure Sam's hands remembered the precise movements needed for such delicate work. With painstaking care, Sam began to carve. Each cut was deliberate, measured, his breathing slow and focused as he worked. The morning light caught the fresh wood shavings as they curled away from his chisel, creating tiny golden spirals that drifted down to the workbench. Leo stood close, not hovering but present, ready to steady Sam's hand if fatigue set in. But Sam's grip remained true, his concentration unwavering as the small flower slowly emerged from the wood. 5 delicate petals, each one carved with the precision that had once made Sam known throughout the region for his craftsmanship. When the last petal was complete, Sam set down his chisel with a gentle click against the workbench. Both men studied the finished piece in silence. The boat was beautiful, simple yet elegant, with clean lines and careful details. The flower at the bow seemed to catch the light, as if it had always been there, waiting to emerge from the wood. "Perfect," Leo said softly, and Sam nodded, running his finger lightly over the carving one last time. They wrapped the boat with reverent care, using soft brown paper that crinkled quietly in their hands. Leo held the paper in place while Sam tied it with string, his fingers remembering the motions of making the proper knots. The small note they had prepared the night before, for Maddie, from a friend who didn't forget, was attached last, Sam's handwriting shaky but legible. The package looked humble, but contained years of waiting, of memory, of promise finally fulfilled. Sam held it carefully in his lap as Leo helped him into the truck, the morning sun warm on their backs as they pulled away from the shop. The drive through town was quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts. They passed familiar streets that had changed over the years. New stores, fresh paint, young families where old ones had once lived. But somehow, the spirit of the place remained the same, like the grain and well-aged wood. The neighborhood they sought lay on the outskirts of town, where newer homes mixed with old. Mia had helped them trace Maddie's address through town records and local connections, discovering that she had eventually bought her childhood home after her parents moved south. Leo parked the truck across the street from a modest 2-story house with blue shutters and flower boxes in the windows. Sam remained in the passenger seat, hands folded over his cane, watching as Leo carefully lifted the wrap boat from the back seat. The morning was still young, but signs of life showed in the house. Curtains drawn back, a light on in what looked like a kitchen window. Leo walked up the neat path to the front porch, his steps measured and quiet. He placed the package gently by the door, making sure it was visible but secure, then pressed the doorbell once before turning back toward the truck. They waited, engine idling softly as footsteps approached from inside the house. The door opened and a young woman appeared, Maddie now grown, but with the same gentle features Sam remembered from years ago when her father had commissioned the boat for her birthday. She looked down, noticed the package, and bent to retrieve it. Her fingers found the note first, and they could see the moment of recognition cross her face as she read it. Carefully, she pulled back the brown paper, revealing the boat beneath. Her free hand flew to her mouth, tears already gathering in her eyes as she cradled the wooden vessel close to her chest. Leo put the truck in gear and they drove away slowly, leaving Maddie on her porch with her long-awaited gift. Sam watched in the side mirror until they turned a corner, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. The day passed quietly at the shop after that. They worked on small projects, cleaned tools, and spoke little, each processing the morning's events in their own way. As evening approached, Sam made his way to the front step of the shop, easing himself down carefully with his cane across his knees. The sunset was beginning to paint the sky in broad strokes of orange and pink, casting long shadows down the street. The air was cooling, carrying the first hints of autumn. Leo appeared in the doorway behind Sam, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in his hands. He sat down beside the older man, passing him one of the mugs. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky change colors. The shop behind them radiated warmth from the day's sun, like a living thing breathing quietly at their backs. The street was peaceful, a few cars passing, the distant sound of children playing, the normal rhythm of a small-town evening. Sam's voice, when it came, was soft but clear in the gathering dusk. "He waited," he said, "so I could come home." Leo nodded, understanding all that those simple words contained. Gratitude, regret, love, and a kind of peace that had been long in coming. No other words were needed as they sat together, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. If you enjoyed the story of Sam and Patch, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.